content forecast. This episode will include discussion around sexual violence and the trauma which occurs as a product of it. No mai haere mai. It's Weekly Liscourse with me, Liz, of course. Talking about some discourse around free speech. What's all this stuff about free speech? Is it a dog whistle? Yes. Is it a philosophical point of debate? Yes, it's all of these things, and we're going to talk about this stuff and some other things today, specifically focusing on John Stuart Mill's defense of free speech in his work on liberty, which is probably going to be really long and confusing and complex, so I'm sorry. But without further ado, here's some stuff that happened this week. This week in Eventsland, the media continued to focus heavily on Trump's response to the Charlottesville white supremacist rally. Steve Bannon is now out of the White House and straight back to Breitbart, promising to continue waging war against the liberal administrative state and his enemies in the White House. The dude is so cocky all the time though, and he tries to make it out like everything he does is part of some elaborate scheme, even when he's obviously just messed something up. In his famous on-the-record interview, where he states that his fascist buddies are clowns, he says he's winning because as everyone focuses on race, he is implementing his shrewd economic nationalist agenda. Next minute, the guy is seriously just out of the White House and can't do shit anymore except for have long phone calls at midnight with Trump. The focus on race issues, however, is pushing and has pushed many groups to organize. And even though the liberal corporate media are hacks and have been focusing way too much on the Trump show and his response to white nationalism, the left is emboldened and pretty united in the face of white supremacy in the US.
Except for those crypto-fascist Stalin bros and edgy radlibs who do no political work outside of Facebook comments.
Right-wing douchebags who have created fake Antifa profiles and a hilariously fake Antifa manual are pissing themselves at their own sock puppet creations. We don't even need to do anything, and they're pissing all their clothes. They change their pants, then they see another statue go down and piss themselves again, saying, "Who's next? Why not Thomas Jefferson? He owned slaves." And then after changing their pants again, they hear someone say, "Sure, why not?" And then they piss their pants again. These piss-smelling reactionaries couldn't have been surprised when thousands of people showed up to counter-protest a far-right march in Boston earlier this week, greatly outnumbering the amount of white supremacists who planned a march, which, like Unite the Right in Charlottesville, was sold as a rally in defense of free speech. Yep, that's a dog whistle.
Here, boy. Come on. Yeah, that's a good boy. Good boy.
We'll have more on this later.
What Bannon doesn't realize is that race and economics are part of the same fundamental question of how should we organize society. Economic issues are social issues, and social issues are economic issues. Many of us do realize this and approach racism in the US as inextricably entrenched in economic interests. We are educating each other and talking about the things which big liberal media does not pay much attention to, or maybe some lip service. On the ground, at grassroots level, it is possible to build up a mass movement against both racist reactionaries and bourgeois exploitation as the same enemy. In the US, statues of racists are coming down, and there will be no wall going up. The police state is being exposed for the racist and murderous institution that it is. Bannon may be smirking and thinking, "My economic nationalism," but what he doesn't realize is that for the first time in decades, there is real potential in the US for left movements to unite, demand, and seize racial and economic justice. While one NAFTA representative from the US criticizes the deal, something which the left agrees with anyway, statues and monuments to murderous white dudes are being pulled down all over the country. I don't think you got anyone but yourself, Bannon, and that's your fault for conflating the left movement with the Democratic Party and the liberal media. Moving on to the Middle East, Battles rage on in Yemen and Syria. In Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, a Saudi-led air raid has killed 41 people. Palestinians in Gaza are now restricted to 2 hours of power each day, as Palestinian classrooms in the occupied West Bank were destroyed by bourgeois settlers. In Syria, Raqqa, stronghold of Daesh, otherwise known as ISIS, remains under siege as the UN have called for a halt in the fight against ISIS. The battle to retake the city had stalled with rising death tolls and destruction. The front lines are bloody as Daesh has dug tunnels and adapted to the SDF supporter airstrikes. The SDF also continues to lose out in skirmishes. Vast fields of landmines prevent them from moving directly towards the city, while they are also privy to surprise attacks. The SDF are surely well trained and have good intel, but Daesh fighters are proving to be too resilient for them to take on in their stronghold at the moment. Further coverage will be made next week about the battle for Raqqa. In the West Bank, Palestine, the facilities demolished included the only kindergarten for the Jabal al-Baba Bedouin community, which was destroyed in the early hours of 21st August, and a primary school in Jubet al-Dib that was demolished on the night of the 22nd of August. The Israeli authorities also dismantled and confiscated solar panels, which is the only source of power, at the primary school in Abu Nuar. The school was also attacked twice last year when parts of it were demolished and equipment confiscated. Third-grade students there take their classes in the local barbershop as the community has been prevented from building basic education facilities. The UN humanitarian chief Stephen O'Brien described the conflict between the Saudi-backed Yemeni government and the Houthis as deplorable, avoidable, and a completely man-made catastrophe. He also said the number of air raids per month is now 3 times higher than last year, and that monthly reports of armed clashes are up 50%. This comes as a rift between the rebellious Saleh-led government and Houthi armed forces emerged. For clarification, Yemen is undergoing a civil war currently, with one side consisting of ex-president Abdullah Saleh, with the help of the Houthi armed group, who are supported by not only Iran, but also Qatar, al-Assad, Hezbollah, and the DPRK. The other side is the forces loyal to the Saudi Arabian-backed Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, who is based in the city of Aden. The Houthis and Saleh control much of the north, including the capital, Sana'a, which is one of the main sites where the Saudi-led airstrikes and attacks are taking place. But a rift between these two groups is forming, as I mentioned earlier. Houthis, who have once fought against their tenuous ally, told Saleh's supporters to not go ahead with plans for a rally after this latest attack. However, the rally went ahead and no casualties were reported. The issue of modern slavery has come up in headlines, with Uber drivers in Indonesia going on strike and rallying for a list of 14 demands, including a basic rate of 2,500 rupiah, which works out to be 19 cents per kilometer, an end to high commissions and fees taken by the company, and the provision of office administration and safety support. One driver said that after doing a 24-hour shift working from one morning to the next, he had only earned the equivalent of $10 US. Most drivers eat only once a day and sometimes lose money during a shift after Uber take 10% of their fare combined with fines for cancellations. The so-called gig economy is not the promising, innovative solution which tech entrepreneurs claim it is, and is rife with exploitation just like any other low-paying, no-security job. Continuing on the topic of modern-day slavery, 2 people have been arrested after 20 suspected victims of modern slavery were located after raids were carried out in 3 restaurants. This was in the West Midlands, UK. Between May 2016 and April 2017, the West Midlands Police recorded 208 slavery offences, up from just over 100 in the previous year, with more than 40 people arrested. This problem also reaches our shores. A study which was put out shows that a large number of migrant workers from the Philippines on dairy farms in Aotearoa are working in such poor conditions that one reports vomiting from spraying chemicals with no protective gear, with another saying it was not uncommon to work a whole month without a day off. These workers have been paid under minimum wage, have no access to breaks, holidays, or proper training. More in Aotearoa, The University of Otago in Otepoti, Dunedin, is scrambling to do damage control as a booklet created by a campus group called Students Against Sexual Violence was mass printed and dropped all over campus. The booklet includes personal experiences of survivors of sexual assault and their dealings with support services and other channels, and concludes that the university is not serious about trying to eliminate sexual violence on campus, and does not give survivors of sexual assault adequate support, but does not limit the problem to just the University of Otago. A survey which has just been released confirms the grim reality in this country, portrayed in the booklet. Not only has the Vice-Chancellor, Harleen Hayne, denied the claims in the booklet, she has also sent her legal goons to insinuate legal threats of defamation against the uni. These litigation threats have been made to the university magazine The Critic, who are denying they have been approached and threatened. They regard an article in a similar vein to the booklet, which was to be published in The Critic but ended up being published in Salient, Victoria University in Wellington students magazine, who also received insinuated threats of a legal nature, but ended up publishing the article with a few changes. The group Students Against Sexual Violence on Friday held a rally and public meeting as part of their call to action. In addition to the Sexual Violence Awareness Project, the University of Otago has also been dealing with backlash to cuts to general staff which have been attempted to be portrayed as positive for students, and a step to create student-facing services. Academic staff in the Tertiary Educators Union have organized a campaign against these cuts, which coincided with a rally on campus. Physical education students have also held their own protest to the cuts, which they believe will harm the PE program at the university. Members of the staff union have also been warned not to involve students in their meetings. They can threaten to sue anything that moves, but Harleen Hayne cannot sue the Streisand effect, named after Barbra Streisand, which refers to the phenomenon of those pursuing legal actions against character defamation, and how the threats being made public make them look shitter than the content they wish to censor. If the Vice-Chancellor thinks she can just waltz around suing everyone, she has another thing coming. The power of the students, the power of the staff, and the power of the media consumer to laugh at her ridiculous and offensive attempts at silencing voices and stifling resistance to the neoliberal corporatized institution she and the Uni Council of bourgeois financial technocrats want to mold. Alright, that's it for the current events. I got links for you. Just check the description on whatever medium you're on. I will have provided links to things like the Students Against Sexual Violence booklet, sources where I got my news, etc. They should be there. If they're not, hit me up and I'll provide you with as much information as I can about the sourcing of my material, because I aim to be approachable. Hit me up with other things on Twitter. If you want to see me cover an issue, or if you've got something happening in your community or on your campus, I would love to talk to you about it and cover you on this show. So yeah, hit me up on Twitter, @Weekly Liscourse. Alright, now we're on to that free speech goodness. Freedom of speech is a concept regularly associated with liberalism and is deeply entrenched in many forms of media, discussion, and institutions in the Western liberal world. However, the concept is, somewhat ironically, permanently contentious and relevant, since certain forms of speech, including but not limited to hate speech, are seen as unwanted, yet censorship by institutions or social pressure also seems to incite advocacy for the silenced, even if the advocate thinks the speech to be reprehensible. John Stuart Mill, the English liberal philosopher, is a huge influence on the philosophical formation of liberal institutions, and free speech is one of them. Usually when people talk about free speech, they are invoking the rationale which Mill formulated. My argument is that Mill's defense of free speech does not hold up to scrutiny when considering the entrenchment of diffuse power relations in society, which the philosopher Michel Foucault brings into the conversation. This is because the conditions in a liberal society that create conversation or discourse are themselves a factor of disciplinary power relations. I also believe that Mill works with an individual subject that is inaccurate and culturally unbound, a fatal error which liberal thinkers from Hobbes and Rousseau to Locke, Mill, and Rawls all make in their attempts to analyze power relations in society. This is not to say that I disagree with the idea of a society which guarantees some form of free speech, but that to make claims regarding the truth value of speech to society and how it relates to knowledge and power, one must use a culturally embedded subject along with an analysis of power relations that is broad enough to include its non-coercive forms. Now bear with me, this might get quite confusing as I will be comparing two radically different views of how power functions and how knowledge and power are related. Although he himself never used the term free marketplace of ideas, John Stuart Mill forwarded the widely cited rationale behind this defense of free speech in his work On Liberty. While the body of Mill's defense of liberty in the book focuses on the ability of the individual to fulfill their needs as they see fit, the points of argument in defense of free speech, and how that is reconciled with arguing in favor of individual rights in the form of negative liberty, freedom from rather than ability to, while debating ideas in the public arena. Here are the four main points which Mill uses to justify his defense of free speech. 1. The idea conveyed in the speech may be true. In this sense, all silence of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. 2. Even if it is not true, there may be a grain of truth to it. 3. If the idea is plainly false or reprehensible, the subject will never fully understand why. 4. If there is no vigorous debate, people risk losing the ability to critically defend positions with truth value. It makes sense that the marketplace analogy is so attached to this defense, since it begins with the formation of the individual as a rational and sovereign actor, and so, the diversity of opinions should be the biggest it can in order to maximize the possibility of attaining truthful knowledge as part of society's possible advancement. I will come back to the points of defense, as well as the points I have derived from the market analogy. John Stuart Mill saw the reformist liberal world as growing a, quote, inclination to stretch unduly the powers of society over the individual, both by the force of opinion and even by that of legislation, unquote. For Mill, the goal of liberal society should be to increase the liberty of the individual as much as possible. However, as noted before, the power of society against the individual is not only seen in a legislative or institutional sense, it also exists in the form of popular opinion. In this way, no government is even needed to silence an individual, since the censorship is done directly by peers appealing to popular orthodoxy. For Mill, then, legislating in favor of free speech is not enough to satisfy the deficit of knowledge which occurs from censorship. Freedom of speech should be a position adopted by each individual, so that no one gets their opinion censored, as the effects lead to a society steeped in dogma and stifling to innovation. Even though a close reading of Mill will reveal that he did not completely subscribe to the idea of the inverse relationship of power and freedom, noting constructive elements of power and the existence of what would be later termed positive and negative freedom, his points of argument in his defense of free speech infer that freedom exists in a political arena of speech so long as power does not limit the bounds of that speech. For Mill, the full freedom to debate should not be guaranteed by the removal of power from these arenas, and this way discussions in truth will not be corrupted by power structures which exist. Alright, I hope you got that fully about Mill's idea of a free marketplace of ideas. Now we're going to move on to the French philosopher Michel Foucault. He is perhaps most famous for his analyses of power in liberal society during the 1970s in what was known as his genealogy period. His idea of separating disciplinary power from sovereign power has been very influential to the way that social theorists view and analyze social relations in a modern context. Analytic philosophy has, however, been slow to adopt or directly confront Foucauldian ideas of power relations. When analytic philosophers do confront Foucault, they tend to label his arguments as unscientific and misinterpret his arguments about how power affects conversation because they do not differentiate between disciplinary and sovereign power. In his work Discipline and Punishment, Michel Foucault frames his analysis of power as an attempt to understand the way modern power relations work differently to pre-liberal societies. He outlines a wide understanding of power relations in liberal society, which includes legislative and institutional coercive power, but also the power relations that work through institutions, cultural norms, and peer relations. His aim was to look at power as a force operating on the micro level as opposed to the societal macro level, in an attempt to understand the current macro power relations as a genealogy, with its origins in the shift from institutional torture and coercive sanctions to rehabilitation and government programs. Foucault uses this understanding of power to derive disciplinary power, power which is exercised through the use of reinforcing norms, creating a gaze that society views individuality from. It exercises itself against the individual to act a certain way, even if no coercion is used. The instruments of power not only punish, but also reward and seek to normalize behavior that the current order deems praiseworthy. In this way, the minds of people are eventually disciplined to act according to certain knowledge and narratives as truth, regardless of the fact that evidence against these ideas may be present and openly shared. The idea of disciplinary power has been a subject of study in psychology with data to support the constructive or positive aspects of disciplinary power. These ideas of power relations can also be expressed in terms of Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony. While he was imprisoned by the Italian fascist regime, Gramsci wondered why the hell the working class would accept fascism, even though it was directly against their interests. This formed the basis of much of what he examined in his collection of writings titled The Prison Notebooks. Gramsci knew that ideas had power and that ideology could be wielded like a weapon by the powerful. Homo economicus, in various social studies, is the name given to a generic human subject of inquiry. The implicit Homo economicus is self-interested and rational. He, almost certainly always a man, is guided by a simple task to increase utility by margins. Most importantly for our concerns, the identity and actions of Homo economicus, while influenced by information he gathers about the outside world, are self-constructed rather than culturally embedded. The use of this subject as a base of social analysis is a flaw of liberal approaches to social sciences, perhaps more specifically analytical schools of liberal philosophy. Specifically, Mill also did not use the term Homo economicus, but he did make assumptions based in such a model. Mill was also aware of the fact that culture and identity were contributors to actions and commitments of people, but he believed that actions and beliefs were critically reflected upon by the individual, so there is, in some sense, sovereign action still attached to the process. The problem with this, however, is that language, like civilization and ethics, is bound in constructed linguistic frameworks which reflect a historical process of power relationships, which he also realizes. Mill also underestimated the extent to which positive power manages to create meaning and value in terms of material action. Rather, he saw the values influenced by culture as antithetical to a rational approach to scientific ethics and economics. To which extent sovereignty influences our choice of language is perhaps unquantifiable unless you were to delve into neuropsychology and be bound to that particular discourse with its own implications, assumptions, and concepts. This is how language and speech both produces and is produced by power. Michel Foucault uses a subject which consists of a multiplicity of possible actions and identities defined by systems of power. This is closer to the culturally embedded subjects which Marxists and constructivists tend to use. Recall Antonio Gramsci. As someone interested in realpolitik and pragmatic approaches to politics, he married that tradition with Marxist historical materialism in an attempt to outline the phenomena of people being guided by ideologies which were against their own interests. Gramsci deemed this concept hegemony, and it helped establish a discourse around power which focused on common narratives that turned individuals into instruments of power. As such, Gramsci believed that there was a common sense and an objective truth which individuals must be turned to. In order to turn to this true sense of class consciousness, the adoption of ideology of critical discourse must be wielded like a weapon against common sense from the analytical viewpoint of cultural hegemony. Society's quest for truth in Mill's framework is similar to this, in the sense that there is an implicitly objective truth to be found. These grains of truth are attained into knowledge through the realm of public discourse by dialectical engagement. For Foucault, however, the search for truth in the modern sense is corrupt, not necessarily that it does not exist, but it is not attached to practical ethics. There cannot be truth in the neutral sense, as truth in ethics cannot be known from an objective standpoint. The attempt to create and maintain a free marketplace of ideas, or any neutral arena of discussion, is therefore tainted with discourse and exercises of disciplinary power. This is not to say that talking about anything is pointless, but rather that we should take this into account and accept that there is no reconciling subjectivity and truth, and that ethical truth exists in societal context rather than a vacuum. So Michel Foucault did not discount objective truth, and was aware that trying to would be futile, since it would require the creation of a truth in order to negate the validity of truths. Rather, Foucault wished that when we engage with discourse surrounding discourse, finding truth lies in seeking, quote, differences in the other, rather than seeking something which was truer than what was already true. Foucault compares the liberal project of the quest for truth to romanticized notions of lighting up all the nook and crannies of a castle darkened by dogma of politics and of the church. All of Mill's argumentative points in his defense of free speech involve the quest for truth and concern the truth value of language. Foucault's warning, then, is that by trying to understand truth, we are necessarily bound to the multiplicity of aspects influenced by discourse and power. To bring back Mill's argument of the overall increase of truthful knowledge from a free market approach as outlined before, the diversity of opinions should be the biggest it can in order to maximize the possibility of attaining truthful knowledge as part of society's possible advancement. This is due to the process which takes place when two opposing ideas thought true collide with each other to make something which is even more true. In this sense, all of these true statements build up into the knowledge of society. Sometimes revolutions of opinions can occur, causing many truths to be revealed, but other truths to be buried, hidden away only to possibly be found later if it were allowed to be found. Mill seems to group all of the known truths in society to constitute its overall knowledge. Michel Foucault, on the other hand, argues that multiple forms of knowledge or knowledges exist within society. Each discourse comes with its own constituency of ideas forming its respective knowledge. The possible forms of knowledge for Foucault are not determined by the activity of the subject. Rather, the disciplinary power exercised through the discourse sets the bounds and trajectory of the knowledge. In this sense, the exercise of power is what creates the knowledge, which John Stuart Mill believes is created by opinions colliding. Another way the concept of disciplinary power undermines Mill's point of argument is the relationship between power and knowledge that Michel Foucault outlines when he refers to the concept of power-knowledge, and explains, "There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power." Compare this to Gramsci, who brings in an interpersonal subjectivity. To create one's personality means to acquire consciousness of them, but this is not simple. To be conscious of them already modifies them. Even the necessary relations, insofar as they are known to be necessary, take on a different aspect. In that sense, knowledge is power. For Gramsci, the bourgeois state, once in power, expanded its domination using ideology and the creation of aforementioned ideological common sense, which works alongside Foucault's explanation of the proliferation of disciplinary power. Gramsci's conception of the hegemonic order refers to the disciplinary power that the state and cultural apparatuses hold over the masses. Then, in order for the means of production to be seized, this order must be opposed by a counter-order or consciousness against it. In a Foucaultian sense, this would be creating a separate knowledge. This is a winnable battle for Gramsci as power and knowledge grows exponentially with growth in numbers. Both Foucault and Gramsci realize that the composition of forces, collective power, acting from each individual in a disciplined hierarchical society is extremely efficient due to the interpersonal articulations influenced by disciplinary power. The idea that society can progress unhindered towards incalculable truthful knowledge if a free market idea was established is utopian to Michel Foucault. He notes that the very establishment of such an arena would signify that disciplinary power was so entrenched that free exchange of ideas would not threaten the order which already exists. It does not matter then if everyone has a platform to speak, as J.S. Mill wants, since the disciplinary power exercised is constantly working to change the knowledges people attain, as well as influencing the power structures which define it. As far as Mill's defense of free speech is concerned, power is something exercised by society against the individual, which, if exercised in the public arena via censorship, constricts overall knowledge and truth. I believe that freedom of speech is important, but that Mill's specific defense of it does not take into account many realities of human nature, social life, and significance of discourse. I have shown that power in the modern sense is broader than just coercive forces when applying critical analysis to the history of power regarding the bourgeois seizure. For Michel Foucault, knowledge is manifested by power. Power is manifested by knowledge, and discourse is both the nexus of power and the tools to create and maintain knowledge. All of these concepts, along with the ideas which are produced within them, are tightly related and influence each other very closely. To carry on from this point would be to turn to defenses of free speech which do not rely on seeking the most amount of truth, make claims about the power within discourse without critically looking at the relationship between discourse and power, reduce power to its coercive forms, as the definition of power should be broad enough to include its constructive forms, or rely on subjects with an overestimated amount of pure individual agency. I believe in a form of free speech which empowers the marginalized and working class against the bourgeois reactionary order of traditionalism, as well as the bourgeois liberal order of self-interest as morality. As institutions make moves to further disempower and divide the working class, we need to be able to speak out against them. There is censorship which is evil, but bleeping out fuck and not letting people wear racist costumes is not evil censorship. Threatening legal action for the publication of an article describing appalling conditions of support for survivors of sexual violence is evil censorship. Refusing to give hate speech a platform is not cruel, nor is a movement to include content forecasting for potentially traumatizing content. Reprimanding people in power for damage they have done and do cannot be equivocated with hurt fifis because you didn't get to publicly bully LGBTQ people. Hey, thanks for listening to episode 2 of Weekly Liscourse. That's all we've got for today. But next week, next Saturday, we'll be back. We'll be discussing something. I don't know what it is yet. But you know what? Check me out on Twitter at Weekly Liscourse. Suggest ideas to me. Suggest constructive points for me. Say whatever you want to me, really. Tell me what you want to hear about, and I promise maybe at some point I'll get around to talking about it. As I said before, at Weekly Liscourse on Twitter, and also I've got a Facebook, which is just Weekly Liscourse. Thanks so much. I love you all, and have a great weekend. Have a coffee, have a smoke, have a laugh, do whatever. Treat yourselves, please, and it'll make me happy.